In 1392, Charles IV was born in the city of Lundsven, the capital of Mulviken, on the eastern side of the island of Fjellenish. At the time, the eastern side of the island was made up of over 40 small tribes and principalities. Over the last 150 years, the kingdom of Fjellenish had been slowly consolidating its power over these states. The people of these states disliked being ruled by the kingdom, though, and formed a coalition to fight back. This is where Charles IV's military career started. Since he was next in line to be the ruler of Mulviken, a relatively major state, he was quickly promoted to be a general of an army with around 250 troops. Over the years, Charles gained a lot of military experience fighting in the quiet hills and rugged mountains of Fjellenish, but commanding this small army gained him little prestige. He strived for more. Eventually, he betrayed the coalition and started fighting for the kingdom of Fjellenish. Rising quickly through the ranks, he was one of the most trusted generals by the time he was 26. While I may cover his rise to power in more depth in a later video, all that is important right now is that he eventually managed to force the coalition to make peace and then betrayed the king of Fjellenish, usurping him and placing himself as king. Throughout his military career, he had made many enemies, especially since he betrayed so many people to become king. Before he could consolidate his power, a massive rebellion erupted in the east, led by the king's son, confusingly named Charles II, the legitimate king of Fjellenish. Despite the threat to his legitimacy, he would eventually defeat Charles II in a pitched battle, the Battle of Asby. Charles was, as always, outnumbered, and, as always, determined to win. Charles II had finally come to him, camped in the small village of Asby. Despite extensively scouting the terrain around the battlefield, it seemed to just be flat plain. There was a forest nearby, but it was guarded by Charles II's scouts, since he knew Charles IV would try to plan an ambush. Did he run out of traps? Had he finally been caught off guard? He knew he needed this decisive victory. He couldn't let this war drag on for longer, but he felt unprepared. He had only around 600 light infantry and 500 cavalry. These troops had fought with him for years, though. They were veterans. He knew the enemy was disorganized, made up of separate armies from separate clans, led by separate generals with different ideas of success. Perhaps he could use this. They had around 1,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. Despite many earlier victories for Charles IV, they just kept coming back with more troops, no matter how many ambushes or traps he had laid. At least he knew he had one big advantage. His troops were more experienced. He gave them some shovels and prepared for the engagement. Charles II had been fighting for so long, lost so many young men, and yet had nothing to show for it. He outnumbered Charles IV, but he had always outnumbered Charles IV, and he always lost. Now he had finally come to him, camped just a few miles away from the village of Asby. He knew Charles IV would try to set a trap, but he had searched the entire battlefield beforehand. It was impossible. Perhaps he had finally been caught off guard. Maybe there were no traps left. He didn't know how many troops the enemy had, but he was sure he had at least double. Just before the battle started, he lined all of his troops up, and had all the other generals do the same. When the battle began, Charles IV had his infantry stationed in front of trenches. Great defensive works, in a great position, but it was surely not enough compared to the magnitude of Charles II's forces. His troops charged, surely outnumbering Charles IV's 3-1. Charles IV didn't even have any cavalry. Charles II could simply lead his cavalry around the trenches. But, despite all odds, Charles IV had set a trap. 300 infantry, 150 on either side, leapt out of the trenches, viciously attacking the coalition troops. And, concealed in a small ditch behind Charles's infantry, was his cavalry. Surprised by the sudden appearance of so many enemy units, Charles II's cavalry routed, with him being knocked off his horse and killed. With the death of Charles II, their one unifying figure, the communication between the remaining generals broke down, none of them agreeing on what to do. Taking advantage of this, Charles was able to focus on one section of the army at a time. Nicholas Valgren pulled back his forces first. But, one by one, the coalition troops were overpowered, and were forced to pull back. In the end, Valentin Holm's contingent was the last one remaining on the field. His troops were encircled, and then slaughtered. With the death of Charles II, Charles IV finally consolidated power over his kingdom. But Charles was not one for peace. The moment the Civil War ended, he reformed his army. Throughout his career, he had learned that the most important quality in an army was rigorous discipline and proper organization. It's what won him so many battles, ensuring that the enemy would break first in any engagement. He turned the army from simple bands of peasants to one well-armed, well-trained professional force. He issued economic reform, making taxes based on wealth, not because he cared for the poor, but because doing so would both gain him support and increase his profits, which he could then use to make his army better. With the new army reforms complete, Charles set out to build a navy. The kingdom of Fjellene had, up to this point, only simple sailboats to defend their coasts and raid the European coast. Charles rebuilt previously destroyed coastal settlements and put huge sums of money towards the production of cannons and timber for new ships. 2 years later, by 1425, he had 25 medium-sized ships of the line at his disposal, enough to launch an invasion. With the island under his control and a brand new army and navy, Charles sought to bring his influence to the mainland. He had been carefully monitoring the events in Europe ever since the Civil War ended, and now he chose a target, Muryol. He knew that the Venaians were likely distracted from the city, with most of their navy and army in the Eurasian Sea region, fighting a coalition war with the Venaian Sultanate. A perfect target. On the first day of spring, 1426, a fleet of 55 ships left port from the Fjellenian capital of Skarvikton. On this fleet, he had around 9,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and 48 newly produced cannons. He knew that this small army wasn't going to be enough, so he also hired Socinian mercenaries, bringing his total up to 13,500 infantry, 21,000 cavalry, and 62 cannons. When his transports arrived near the waters of Muryol, he encountered an unexpected amount of resistance. Muryol actually had its own defensive navy, capable of rivaling the new and inexperienced Fjellene navy. To protect himself and his troops, he had his transports split off from his ships of the lines, which pinned down the Muryolian navy and prevented it from chasing the fleeing transports. Charles IV had his ship, along with his cavalry, land at the nearby town of Chitevsk to resupply, while his main force of infantry arrived closer to the city. Led by Otto Schweiger, a Crown 14 mercenary officer, they arrived at Muryol and made camp. In the night, Charles arrived with his cavalry, bolstering the small force, and when the day broke, despite still being heavily outnumbered, he ordered a full frontal assault on the city walls. You might be wondering about Charles's plan here. He was besieging one of the most fortified cities in Europe, the capital of one of the richest empires in Europe, while being outnumbered 2-1. Well, actually, he had a pretty good reason to believe he had an advantage here. You see, there's something you have to know about Muryol at this time. The Venaians had actually been at war with the Venaian Sultanate for the last 2 years, greatly depleting their manpower. In fact, much of the Venaian defending army at Muryol were actually mercenaries bought by the nobles, who kept them in the city citadel for much of the battle. And on top of this, politically, Muryol was a mess. You see, Muryol was a huge trading hub, one of the reasons the Venaians were so rich. And being a huge trading hub meant that a small majority of the population were actually of European descent and were viewed below the native Turks. Because of this, there were large class divisions in the population. There were 2 major factions, the Turkish Red Houses and the European Yellow Houses. Now, Muryol, despite being the capital of the empire, was actually technically autonomous, having its own governor and parliament separate from the Sultanate, which was constantly moving locations due to wars it was fighting. This parliament wasn't democratic, though. Instead of being elected, they were appointed by the governor, a hereditary position. For the last 4 years, the governor had been Tevik, a person known for discriminating against Europeans. As such, almost all of the parliament were radical Turkish nobility. This parliament was not well liked by the Yellow Houses, since they were always passing laws targeted against them. For example, the Red Houses were allowed to live wherever they wanted, but the parliament passed laws that contained the Yellow Houses to just the southern portion of the city. On top of this, there were also 2 major ports in Muryol, one at the north and one at the south. The parliament had recently built 5 bridges they claimed were the connected islands to the main city. Although this purpose was achieved, it did not go unnoticed that the bridges were placed explicitly to block ships from traveling to the southern port. Due to all of this infighting, the defenses of the city were rather lopsided, with there being less guards and less fortifications to the southeast, where the Yellow Houses lived. Charles knew this, and thus, when he ordered the full frontal assault on Muryol, he led his veteran cavalry to the far eastern wall. Upon seeing his troops, the Yellow Houses actually embraced his arrival, opening the gates and aiding the troops. In the city, many Yellow Houses also barricaded large streets to sabotage the Venaian defense efforts. Some even took up arms and directly attacked the Venaian troops.